She walked into the training facility wearing grandmother's cardigan and sensible shoes, carrying what looked like a knitting bag. The instructors barely glanced up from their clipboards. The younger recruits snickered quietly among themselves, whispering about budget cuts and diversity quotas. Nobody expected her to even qualify for the basic marksmanship test. But when she settled behind that rifle and took her first shot, the range went dead silent. The target checker called out a score that made everyone think the equipment was malfunctioning. Then she fired again and again. By the fourth shot, nobody was laughing anymore, because what they were witnessing wasn't just accuracy, it was something that defied everything they thought they knew about elite military training. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog still clung to the edges of Fort Meridian's training complex like stubborn smoke from a dying campfire. Through the chain-link perimeter, the California hills rolled away in waves of brown and gold, dotted with scrub oak that caught the early sunlight filtering through the marine layer. The air carried that particular smell of military installations everywhere: diesel fuel, gun oil, and the faint metallic tang of weapons that had seen serious use. Major Sarah Chen adjusted her tactical vest one final time before stepping out of the administrative building. At 38, she moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd learned to waste neither time nor energy on anything that didn't contribute to the mission. Her dark hair was regulation short, her combat boots polished to a mirror shined despite the early hour, and her clipboard held the names of 23 candidates who'd applied for the most selective program in the United States military. The Kohene Special Operations Sniper Course had a failure rate that hovered around 80% on a good year. The selection process was designed to eliminate weaknesses before they became liabilities, to filter out anyone who couldn't handle the physical demands, the psychological pressure, or the absolute precision required when a single missed shot could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Chen had been running this program for 6 years, and she'd developed an eye for spotting the candidates who would wash out before they even fired their first round. The group assembled on the concrete pad outside the weapons storage facility looked exactly like every other class she'd evaluated. Mostly men in their early 20s, all of them in peak physical condition, all of them carrying themselves with the swagger that came from believing they were the best their respective units had to offer. Marines, Army Rangers, Air Force Special Operations, Navy SEALs, the cream of the crop, at least on paper. Chen's eyes swept across the formation, mentally cataloging each candidate based on their posture, their equipment, the way they held themselves while waiting for instructions. She'd learned to read confidence versus arrogance, determination versus desperation, the subtle differences that separated those who would endure from those who would crumble under pressure. Her gaze stopped when it reached the back row, where someone clearly didn't belong. Margaret Delacreel stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun that had probably taken her all of 3 minutes to arrange. She wore the same base-issued fatigues as everyone else, but somehow they looked different on her, like she'd borrowed them from a grandchild for a family costume party. At 57, she was old enough to be the mother of most of the other candidates, and the reading glasses perched on her nose caught the morning light in a way that made her look more like a substitute teacher than a warrior. Chen checked her roster again, thinking there must have been some administrative error. But there it was in black ink: Delacroix Margaret, a staff sergeant, Army Reserve, forward observer. The paperwork was legitimate, signed by a colonel. Chen didn't recognize with qualification scores that looked impressive enough until you realized they were all from reserve training exercises rather than active combat deployments. The other candidates had noticed Margaret too. Chen caught fragments of whispered conversations, the kind of barely audible commentary that soldiers made when they thought their instructors weren't listening. Someone mentioned diversity initiatives. Another voice suggested budget cuts were forcing them to accept anyone who could fill a slot. A particularly loud whisper wondered if the military was running some kind of social experiment. Margaret seemed completely oblivious to the speculation swirling around her. She stood at attention with the kind of stillness that suggested she'd been holding military postures since before most of these men were born. Her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the training complex like she was reading something written in the distant hills. Chen made a mental note to speak with whoever had approved Margaret's application. The Special Operations Sniper course wasn't a place for feel-good stories or second chances. It was a finishing school for killers designed to produce marksmen who could eliminate targets at distances that required mathematics as much as marksmanship. The physical demands alone would break most people half Margaret's age, and the psychological pressure had been known to crack operators with decades of combat experience. "Listen up," Chen called out, her voice carrying across the formation with the authority of someone who'd learned to command attention without raising her volume. "You're here because someone in your chain of command believes you have the potential to become a military sniper. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to test that belief in ways that will push you beyond every limit you think you understand." She began walking along the front rank, making eye contact with each candidate as she passed. "This isn't infantry training. This isn't even advanced marksmanship. This is a precision instrument course designed to turn you into a weapon system that can deliver lethal force at extreme distances under conditions that would paralyze most people. If you're here because you think sniping is glamorous, or because you saw something impressive in a movie, or because you want to add a cool qualification to your record, you're in the wrong place." The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the fog and promising another scorching day in the California hills. Chen could already feel sweat beginning to form under her tactical vest, and she knew that within a few hours, the temperature would climb past 90 degrees. The candidates would spend the morning learning equipment familiarization, but by afternoon, they'd be crawling through obstacle courses designed to simulate the kind of terrain movement that real snipers faced in the field. "First phase is physical conditioning and basic marksmanship," Chen continued. "You'll be running 20-mile courses with full gear, conducting precision shooting under time pressure, and learning to function on 3 hours of sleep while maintaining accuracy standards that won't accept anything less than perfection." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Second phase is advanced fieldcraft camouflage, concealment, target identification, and stalking techniques. Third phase is psychological conditioning, where we'll test your ability to maintain focus under extreme stress. She paused in front of a young Marine whose name tag read Morrison. He looked like he'd stepped out of a recruitment poster, all squared shoulders and determined jawline. The average washout rate for this program is 82%. That means roughly 18 of you will make it to graduation. The rest will return to your units with a better understanding of your limitations. Chen's eyes found Margaret again, standing motionless in the back row like a statue carved from granite. For a moment, their gazes met, and Chen was surprised by what she saw there. Not nervousness or uncertainty, but a kind of patient alertness that reminded her of experienced hunters she'd known, people who could wait for hours without moving, watching for the perfect moment to take their shot. "Today we begin with weapons familiarization and baseline accuracy testing," Chen announced. "You'll be shooting the M24 sniper weapon system at targets ranging from 200 to 600 meters. This is not a competition. This is a diagnostic assessment to determine your current skill level and identify areas that need improvement." The weapons storage facility opened with a heavy metallic clang that echoed across the training complex. Armorer Sergeant Davis emerged with a cart loaded with rifles, each one wrapped in soft cases that had seen thousands of training cycles. The M24 was a reliable workhorse, a bolt-action rifle chambered in 7.62 millimeters netto. That had been serving as the military's primary sniper weapon for over 2 decades. Not the most advanced system in the inventory, but proven, accurate, and forgiving enough for training purposes. "Form single file," Chen ordered. "Draw your weapon, verify it's clear, and proceed to the firing line. You'll have 10 minutes to familiarize yourself with the rifle's characteristics before we begin the assessment." The candidates moved with the mechanical precision of people who'd handled weapons their entire military careers. Each one accepted their rifle with the kind of reverence that serious shooters reserve for precision instruments, running their hands along the stock, checking the scope alignment, testing the trigger pull to get a feel for the system they'd be using for the next 6 weeks. Margaret was the last to draw her weapon. She accepted the M24 from Sergeant Davis with a polite nod, then surprised everyone by immediately field stripping the bolt action with movements so fluid they looked almost unconscious. Her fingers moved across the components with the kind of familiarity that came from handling similar weapons for years, checking the firing pin, examining the bolt face, running her thumb along the barrel to check for any irregularities that might affect accuracy. "Interesting technique," Davis muttered to Chen as they watched Margaret reassemble the rifle in half the time it had taken most of the other candidates to complete their initial inspections. Chen was beginning to suspect that Margaret Delacroix might be more than she appeared. The paperwork showed reserve training, but the way she handled that rifle suggested someone who'd spent serious time behind precision weapons. Not the fumbling uncertainty of a weekend warrior, but the smooth competence of someone who'd made shooting a central part of their life. The firing line stretched across a concrete pad that looked out over the training complex's rifle range. Targets were positioned at measured distances, each one marked with range flags that snapped in the morning breeze. 200 meters, 300, 400, 500, 600 distances that required real skill to hit consistently, especially with iron sights or basic optics. "Take your positions," Chen called out. "You'll fire 5 rounds at each target distance, beginning with 200 meters. You have 30 seconds between shots. Scoring will be based on group size and accuracy. Questions?" No one had any questions. These were all experienced shooters who understood the basics of marksmanship, even if they'd never attempted the kind of precision work that sniper training demanded. Chen watched them settle into their shooting positions, adjusting their bipods, checking their sight pictures, preparing for what most of them probably considered a routine qualification exercise. Margaret chose a position at the far end of the firing line, away from the clusters of younger candidates who'd naturally gravitated toward each other. She spread a small mat on the concrete, adjusted her rifle's bipod with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested she'd performed this routine thousands of times before, and settled into a prone position that looked comfortable enough to maintain for hours. "Commence firing," Chen announced. The first shots rang out in a ragged sequence as each candidate took their own time to settle into their shooting rhythm. Most of them were good. Chen could tell by the sound of their shots, the steady rhythm. That indicated controlled breathing and smooth trigger pull. These were experienced marksmen who'd earned their way to this course through demonstrated competence. The target checkers moved downrange with spotting scopes, calling out scores that confirmed what Chen already knew. Most of the candidates were shooting groups that clustered around the center of their targets, with accuracy that would have been impressive for regular infantry but was merely adequate for sniper training. Good enough to pass basic marksmanship, but not exceptional. Then Margaret fired her first shot. Even from 50 meters away, Chen could see the spotting scope operator pause, then look again through his optic. He keyed his radio twice then. A third time, using the signal that meant he needed to recheck his reading. "Target 7, 200 meters, the spotter's voice crackled through the radio. "Score, X-ring, center mass." "Perfect, Boole." Chen felt her eyebrows rise slightly. An X-ring hit at 200 meters was good shooting for anyone, but it was particularly impressive for someone's first shot with an unfamiliar rifle. Lucky, probably, but still noteworthy. Margaret's second shot followed 30 seconds later. Same result, perfect center hit. By the third shot, Chen was watching Margaret's position through binoculars. The older woman lay perfectly still behind her rifle, her breathing so controlled. It was barely visible. Her trigger finger moved with the kind of smooth, straight-back motion that shooting instructors spent years trying to teach to new marksmen. No jerking, no hesitation, just steady pressure until the shot broke clean. Target 7, 300 meters, the radio crackled. Another X-ring, dead center. The other candidates were starting to notice. Chen caught several of them glancing down the firing line toward Margaret's position, their own shooting rhythm disrupted by the realization that the grandmother in Azafra, the borrowed fatigues, was outperforming everyone on the line. Margaret's fourth shot rang out with the same mechanical precision as the first three. The radio response came back immediately. Target 7, 400 meters. X-ring, center. Mass. Chen found herself holding her breath as Margaret prepared for her fifth shot. 4 perfect hits in a row was remarkable shooting under any circumstances, but doing it with an unfamiliar rifle at progressively longer distances suggested a level of skill that went far beyond reserve training exercises. The final shot broke, with a sound that was somehow different from the others, cleaner, more decisive, like the period at the end of a perfectly constructed sentence. Margaret held her position for a moment, then smoothly worked the bolt and cleared her rifle with movements that looked more like muscle memory than conscious action. Target 7, 500 meters, the radio reported. Fing, dead center. Perfect score. The firing line had gone completely quiet. Even the candidates who were still shooting their own strings had stopped to stare at the woman, who'd just turned in a performance that belonged in a marksmanship textbook rather than a first-day evaluation. Chen lowered her binoculars and walked toward Margaret's position. The older woman was sitting up now, calmly cleaning her rifle with a small cloth she'd produced from somewhere in her gear. Her expression was neutral, neither proud nor apologetic, just the kind of matter-of-fact competence that came from someone who'd been shooting at this level for so long that excellence had become routine. Nice shooting, Staff Sergeant, Chen sighed, stopping beside Margaret's position. Margaret looked up from her rifle cleaning with the kind of mild surprise that suggested she hadn't expected anyone to comment on her performance. Thank you, Major. The rifle shoots well. Good barrel, consistent trigger pull. Whoever maintains your weapons knows their business. Chen studied Margaret's face, looking for signs of false modesty or hidden pride. What she found was something more unsettling: complete sincerity. Margaret wasn't being modest about her shooting. She genuinely seemed to consider 5 perfect shots at progressively longer distances to be unremarkable. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Chen asked. Margaret's hands continued their methodical cleaning of the rifle components. Here and there. I've been shooting since I was 12. My father taught me on his farm in Montana. Had to keep the coyotes away from the livestock. It was a perfectly reasonable answer that explained absolutely nothing. Chen had grown up around farm kids who'd learned to shoot young, and while many of them were good marksmen, they didn't typically turn in perfect scores on their first day at sniper school. The kind of shooting Margaret had just demonstrated required not just natural ability, but years of disciplined practice under controlled conditions. What's your background, Staff Sergeant? Chen asked. Your file shows reserve training, but I'm curious about your civilian experience. Margaret finished cleaning her rifle and began reassembling it with the same fluid motions she'd used during the initial inspection. I taught high school mathematics for 30 years. Coached the school's rifle team in my spare time. We won state championships 6 times. The answer was so mundane, so completely ordinary, that Chun found herself wondering if she'd imagined the performance she'd just witnessed. High school. Math teachers didn't shoot like special operations snipers. They didn't handle military weapons with the kind of unconscious competence that suggested decades of serious training. You competed nationally? Chun pressed. Margaret's fingers paused for just a moment in their work, such a brief hesitation that Chun almost missed it. Nothing too serious. Local competitions mostly. Regional championships a few times. It was the kind of answer that invited follow-up questions, but something in Margaret's tone suggested that she'd said as much as she intended to say. Chun recognized the technique giving enough information to satisfy curiosity while revealing nothing that mattered. The other candidates were finishing their shooting strings now, and Chun could hear the radio chatter as spotters called in scores that ranged from respectable to impressive. Good shooting, all of it, but nothing that approached what Margaret had just accomplished. "Staff Sergeant," Chun said, "I want you to know that what you just did was exceptional. That was some of the best shooting I've seen on this range." Margaret looked up from her rifle with an expression that might have been surprise. "Really? It felt a bit off to me. I think the scope tracking might be slightly inconsistent. Nothing major, but I noticed the third shot pulled just a hair to the left." Chun stared at her for a moment, trying to process what she'd just heard. Margaret was critiquing a performance that had been literally perfect, analyzing minute variations that existed only in her own perception. It was like watching someone complain about a Rembrandt because they didn't like the way the paint had been applied to one tiny corner of the canvas. "The scope tracking was fine," Chun said slowly. "You shot a perfect score." Margaret shrugged with the kind of casual dismissal that suggested perfect scores were routine occurrences in her world. "If you say so, Major. I appreciate the feedback." She stood and shouldered her rifle with movements that were becoming increasingly familiar, smooth, efficient, unconscious. Around them, the other candidates were beginning to police their brass and secure their equipment, but Chun noticed that several of them were still stealing glances at Margaret, trying to reconcile what they'd just witnessed with their assumptions about who belonged in this course. "Fall in for critique," Chun called out, and the candidates formed up in their original formation. She walked to the front of the group, her mind still processing what she'd just observed. "Today's baseline assessment gave us a clear picture of your current skill levels," she began. "Most of you shot well enough to continue in the program. A few of you exceeded expectations." Her eyes found Margaret in the back row, still standing with that same patient stillness that had characterized her presence since the beginning of the day. Staff Sergeant Delacroix, front and center. Margaret moved to the front of the formation, with the kind of measured pace that suggested she'd been called out for recognition before. She stood at attention, her eyes fixed on the horizon beyond Chun's shoulder, waiting for whatever was coming next. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chun announced, "what you just witnessed was a perfect score on the baseline assessment. 5 shots, 5 distances, 5 perfect hits. That's the kind of shooting this course is designed to produce. Staff Sergeant Delacroix has just demonstrated the standard you'll all be working toward." The silence that followed was different from the quiet that had settled over the firing line during Margaret's shooting. This was the silence of people reassessing everything they thought they knew about their situation. Chun could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. If the grandmother in the borrowed fatigues could shoot like that, what did it mean for their own chances? If someone they'd dismissed as a diversity hire could turn in a performance that belonged in a training manual, what other assumptions were they making that might prove equally wrong? "Class dismissed," Chun announced. "Report to the physical training complex at 1400 hours for conditioning assessment. Uniform will be PT gear and full field equipment." The candidates dispersed with the kind of subdued conversation that followed any event that forced people to reconsider their assumptions. Chun watched them go, noting how they moved around. Margaret rather than with her, creating the kind of respectful distance that people maintained around something they didn't quite understand. Margaret was the last to leave, taking her time to secure her equipment and double-check her gear. When she finally approached Chun, her expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Major," she said, "I want you to know that I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I know my presence might seem unusual, but I'll do my best not to let the program down." Chun studied her for a moment, trying to read the subtext behind the carefully neutral words. "Staff Sergeant, I think you've already proven that you belong here. The question is whether the rest of us are ready for what you're going to show us." Margaret's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it was gone so quickly that Chun wasn't entirely sure she'd seen it. "We'll find out, I suppose." She walked away across the training complex, her figure small and unremarkable against the vast expanse of California hills. But Chun found herself watching until Margaret disappeared into the administrative building, wondering what other surprises the next 6 weeks might hold. The afternoon sun was already promising another scorching day, and Chun knew that the physical conditioning assessment would push every candidate to their limits. But for the first time in her career running the Special Operations Sniper course, she found herself curious about whether the limits everyone assumed might not be exactly where they thought they were. Behind her, the empty firing line stretched away toward targets that still bore the evidence of the morning's shooting. At Target 7, 5 holes clustered in the center of the X-ring told a story that would be discussed in whispered conversations for weeks to come. It was the kind of shooting that legends were built on, turned in by someone who looked like she should be teaching Sunday school rather than precision marksmanship. Chun shook her head and started walking toward the administrative building. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for the candidates to prove themselves or wash out. But she suspected that Margaret Delacroix had already proven something that most of them were still trying to understand. The question was what she would prove next. The physical training complex at Fort Meridian had been designed by someone who understood that breaking people down was often the first step toward building them back up stronger. The obstacle course stretched across 3 acres of carefully engineered terrain that simulated every hostile environment a sniper might encounter in the field. Sand pits that recreated desert conditions, water obstacles that mimicked river crossings, concrete barriers that forced candidates to practice urban movement techniques, and dense brush sections where concealment was the difference between mission success and enemy detection. Major Chun stood on the observation platform overlooking the course, watching the 23 candidates assemble at the starting line. The afternoon heat had climbed past 95 degrees, and the California sun beat down on the training complex with the kind of relentless intensity that turned physical exertion into a test of willpower as much as conditioning. Each candidate wore full field gear, 60 pounds of equipment that included weapons, ammunition, communication devices, and survival gear that would be essential during real sniper operations. Margaret Delacroix stood among the group wearing the same regulation PT uniform as everyone else, but somehow she looked different from the others. While the younger candidates stretched and prepared with the nervous energy of athletes before a competition, Margaret simply waited with that same patient stillness she'd displayed on the firing line. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her reading glasses hung from a cord around her neck, making her look more like someone's aunt preparing for a nature walk than a candidate for the most demanding military training in the world. The whispered conversations from the morning had evolved into something more complex after Margaret's shooting performance. Where there had been dismissive jokes earlier, now there was a kind of wary respect mixed with confusion. The younger candidates couldn't reconcile what they'd witnessed with their assumptions about age, gender, and military capability. Some of them were beginning to suspect that Margaret might be more than she appeared, but none of them had figured out exactly what that might mean. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez emerged from the equipment shed, carrying a tablet loaded with stopwatch applications and performance tracking software. At 28, he'd been running physical conditioning assessments for 3 years, and he'd developed an eye for predicting which candidates would excel and which would struggle. The course he designed was brutal but fair, demanding the kind of endurance and mental toughness that real sniper operations required. "Listen up," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying across the assembly area with practiced authority. "This course is designed to simulate the physical demands you'll face during actual sniper missions. You'll be moving through 12 stations that test different aspects of field capability. Crawling through confined spaces, climbing obstacles, under time pressure, maintaining weapon systems while exhausted, and demonstrating that you can think clearly when your body wants to quit." He gestured toward the starting line, where orange cones marked the beginning of a route that disappeared into the brush beyond the first obstacle. "You'll complete the course individually, but your times will be recorded and compared. The standard for passing is 35 minutes. The record for this course is 22 minutes and 14 seconds, set by a Navy SEAL last year who's now operating somewhere I can't tell you about." Chen watched the candidates as Rodriguez explained the course requirements. Most of them were nodding along with the kind of confidence that came from years of physical training and successful completion of other military courses. These were elite operators who'd already proven themselves in their respective specialties, and they approached physical challenges with the assumption that superior conditioning would carry them through whatever the course demanded. Margaret listened to the briefing with the same focused attention she'd brought to everything else. But Chen noticed something different in her posture. Where the younger candidates were psyching themselves up for a physical ordeal, Margaret seemed to be conducting some kind of internal calculation, as if she were measuring the course requirements against capabilities that only she fully understood. "First up, Corporal Martinez," Rodriguez announced, checking his roster. "You've got the course to yourself. Next candidate starts when you're clear of Station 3. Martinez was a Marine Force recon operator who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts taken from a fitness magazine. 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle and competitive determination. He moved to the starting line with the kind of aggressive confidence that had probably served him well in previous training situations. He checked his gear one final time, adjusted his weapon sling, and settled into a runner's crouch that suggested he planned to attack the course rather than simply complete it. "Begin," Rodriguez called out, and Martinez exploded forward like he'd been shot from a cannon. Chen tracked his progress through binoculars as he powered through the first obstacles with the kind of raw athleticism that made difficult tasks look routine. Sandpit crossing in under 2 minutes, rope climb that barely slowed him down, weapon maintenance station where he field stripped and reassembled his rifle while lying in 6 inches of muddy water. Fast, strong, technically proficient, exactly the kind of performance Chen expected from someone who'd earned his way to this course. Martinez disappeared into the brush section that marked the midpoint of the course, and Rodriguez started the countdown for the next candidate. "Sergeant Williams, you're up in 30 seconds. The pattern continued with methodical precision. Each candidate attacked the course with their own approach, some favoring speed over technique, others taking a more measured pace that prioritized accuracy over raw time. All of them were impressive in their own ways, turning in performances that demonstrated the kind of physical capability that the military selection processes were designed to identify and develop. 28 minutes for Martinez, 31 for Williams, 29 for a Navy SEAL named Thompson, who moved through the obstacles with the kind of fluid efficiency that suggested he'd encountered similar challenges before. Good times, all of them, well within the standards required for the course. By the time Rodriguez called Margaret's name, she was the only candidate remaining at the starting line. The others had finished their runs and were scattered around the observation area, drinking water and comparing notes on technique and timing. Most of them were still catching their breath despite being in peak physical condition, and their gear was soaked with sweat that spoke to the course's demanding nature. "Staff Sergeant Delacroix," Rodriguez announced, glancing at his tablet with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure what to expect. "You're up." Margaret moved to the starting line with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout the day. She checked her gear with movements that were thorough but efficient, adjusted her weapon sling to a position that looked more comfortable than tactical, and settled into what could generously be called a starting position, where the other candidates had crouched like sprinters preparing for a race. Margaret simply stood upright with her hands on her hips, looking out over the course like she was planning a route through familiar territory. Chun found herself leaning forward on the observation platform, genuinely curious about what was going to happen next. Margaret's shooting performance had been remarkable, but physical conditioning was a different kind of challenge entirely. Raw marksmanship could be maintained well into middle age and beyond, but the explosive athleticism required for obstacle courses typically peaked much earlier and declined rapidly after 30. "Begin," Rodriguez called out. Margaret started moving at what could only be described as a brisk walk. Not the explosive sprint that had characterized every other candidate's approach, but a measured pace that suggested she was settling in for a journey rather than a race. The other candidates exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to barely concealed amusement. After the morning shooting demonstration, some of them had begun to wonder if Margaret might surprise them again. But watching her casual approach to the starting line seemed to confirm their original assumptions about age and physical limitations. She reached the first obstacle, a sand pit that required candidates to low crawl under razor wire while carrying their full equipment load, and surprised everyone by not hesitating even slightly. Where the younger candidates had psyched themselves up for the unpleasant work of crawling through sand that would fill their gear and irritate every inch of exposed skin, Margaret simply dropped to her belly and began moving forward with movements that were economical rather than fast. Chun watched through binoculars as Margaret navigated the razor wire with the kind of careful precision that avoided the dramatic speed of other candidates, but also eliminated the time lost to snagged equipment or minor injuries that had slowed several of the earlier runs. She moved under the wire like someone who'd done similar work before, keeping her profile low and her equipment properly positioned to avoid entanglement. Emerging from the sand pit, Margaret brushed off her gear with a few efficient movements and continued toward the rope climb that had challenged every previous candidate. The rope stretched 30 feet up to a platform that marked the course's high point, requiring both upper body strength and climbing technique that most people struggled to maintain under the stress of competition and exhaustion. The other candidates had attacked the rope with aggressive determination, powering their way to the top through sheer muscular effort that left them breathing hard and fighting fatigue that would affect their performance on subsequent obstacles. Margaret approached the rope differently. Instead of grabbing it and immediately beginning to climb, she spent nearly 15 seconds examining the setup, testing the rope's condition, and positioning herself in a way that looked more like preparation than hesitation. When she finally began climbing, her technique was completely different from what they'd seen earlier. Where the younger candidates had relied primarily on arm strength, Margaret used her legs and body positioning to minimize the energy required for each upward movement. She climbed steadily rather than quickly, but without the pauses and repositioning that had characterized some of the more athletic performances. "That's interesting," Rodriguez muttered, watching Margaret's progress through his own binoculars. "She's using mountaineering technique rather than military climbing. More efficient for longer distances." Margaret reached the platform in what appeared to be less time than several candidates who'd climbed much more aggressively. She paused at the top just long enough to check her equipment, then rappelled down the descent line with the kind of controlled speed that suggested familiarity with rope work that went beyond basic military training. A weapon maintenance station was next to timed exercise that required candidates to field strip, clean, and reassemble their rifles while lying in muddy water that made every movement more difficult and every component harder to see. It was designed to test the kind of weapon handling skills that snipers needed when operating in hostile environments where equipment maintenance might be required under less than ideal conditions. Margaret settled into the muddy depression that marked the maintenance area and immediately began working on her rifle with movements that were so smooth they looked almost automatic. Her fingers moved across the components with the kind of unconscious competence that came from performing the same task thousands of times. And Chung realized that Margaret was completing the exercise faster than any of the previous candidates, despite working at what appeared to be a casual pace. "Time," Rodriguez called out as Margaret finished reassembling her rifle and cycled the action to verify proper function. "What was her time?" Chun asked. Rodriguez checked his tablet with an expression that suggested he thought his equipment might be malfunctioning. 3 minutes, 42 seconds. That's 15 seconds faster than the previous best today. Margaret emerged from the maintenance station and continued toward the brush section that marked the midpoint of the course. This was where technique and experience typically separated the exceptional candidates from those who were merely athletic. The brush was thick enough to provide concealment, but dense enough to snag equipment and slow progress. Candidates had to balance speed with stealth, maintaining forward momentum while avoiding the kind of noise that would betray their position in a real operational environment. The younger candidates had approached the brush section with varying degrees of success. Some had tried to power through quickly, accepting the noise and equipment damage in exchange for reduced time. Others had moved more carefully, prioritizing stealth over speed, but losing valuable seconds that added up over the course of the entire exercise. Margaret disappeared into the brush like she'd been swallowed by the vegetation. For several long minutes, there was no visible sign of her progress, no movement in the branches, no sound of equipment brushing against obstacles, no indication that anyone was moving through the dense cover at all. "Can you see her?" Chun asked Rodriguez, who was tracking Margaret's progress with binoculars and a GPS device that showed her approximate location. "GPS shows she's moving, but I can't see anything," Rodriguez replied with something that might have been admiration in his voice. "Whatever she's doing in there, she's doing it quietly." Margaret emerged from the far side of the brush section, with her equipment properly positioned and no visible signs of the struggle that had marked every other candidate's passage through the obstacle. Her uniform was clean, her gear was secure, and she moved with the same measured pace that had characterized her approach to every previous challenge. The remaining obstacles passed in a blur of competent performance that defied every assumption about age and physical capability. Balance beam over a water obstacle completed with the steady confidence of someone who'd never doubted their ability to maintain stability under pressure. Wall climb that she approached with technique rather than strength, using footholds and body positioning that made the 12-foot barrier look manageable rather than intimidating. Final sprint to the finish line that wasn't really a sprint at all, but a sustained pace that brought her home with energy reserves that most of the younger candidates had exhausted miles earlier. "Time," Rodriguez called out as Margaret crossed the finish line. She stopped and stood quietly while Rodriguez calculated her performance, her breathing only slightly elevated despite having just completed a course that had left younger, presumably fitter candidates gasping for air and fighting exhaustion. Around the observation area, the other candidates were staring with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching awe. Rodriguez stared at his tablet for a long moment, then looked up at Chun with an expression that suggested he thought his equipment had definitely malfunctioned. "Major, I think there's something wrong with the timing system. What's the time?" Chun asked, though she suspected she already knew what Rodriguez was going to tell her. 21 minutes, 58 seconds, Rodriguez said slowly. "That's 16 seconds faster than the course record." The silence that followed was complete and profound. Every candidate, every instructor, Every staff member within earshot stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at Margaret, who was calmly checking her equipment and apparently unaware that she'd just accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible. Chen climbed down from the observation platform and approached Margaret with the kind of measured pace that people used when they weren't sure whether they were approaching a person or a phenomenon. Margaret looked up as Chen drew near, her expression calm and vaguely questioning, as if she were wondering why everyone had suddenly stopped talking. "Staff Sergeant," Chen said carefully, "are you aware that you just broke the course record?" Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly in what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Did I? I'm sorry, I wasn't really paying attention to time. I was focused on completing the obstacles properly." Chen studied Margaret's face for any sign of false modesty or hidden satisfaction. What she found was the same matter-of-fact competence that had characterized Margaret's response to her shooting performance earlier. No pride, no excitement, just the kind of casual acceptance that suggested breaking records was routine rather than remarkable. "How?" Chen asked. "That course is designed to push elite operators to their limits. You just completed it faster than anyone in the program's history, and you look like you could do it again right now." Margaret considered the question with the thoughtful expression of someone who is genuinely trying to provide a helpful answer. "I suppose it's just a matter of efficient movement. When you approach obstacles as problems to be solved rather than barriers to be overcome, you tend to find solutions that require less energy expenditure." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation that explained absolutely nothing. Chen had watched dozens of elite operators attack that course with every technique and strategy they could devise, and none of them had approached Margaret's performance. The combination of speed, efficiency, and apparent ease suggested capabilities that went far beyond what reserve training and high school coaching could provide. "Where did you learn movement techniques like that?" Chen pressed. Margaret's pause was so brief that someone who wasn't watching carefully might have missed it entirely. "Here and there. I've always enjoyed hiking and outdoor activities. Montana has a lot of wilderness areas where you learn to move efficiently over rough terrain." Another perfectly mundane explanation that somehow failed to account for what everyone had just witnessed. Chen was beginning to understand that Margaret Delacroix was either the most naturally gifted athlete in military history, or she was something else entirely, something that her paperwork and cover story were carefully designed to conceal. "Staff Sergeant," Chen said, "I want you to know that what you've accomplished today is unprecedented. Both your shooting and your physical performance are well beyond anything we typically see in this program." Margaret's response was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on concrete as someone approached the group. Chen turned to see Colonel Harrison, striding across the training complex with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested he'd been watching the afternoon's events with considerable interest. Colonel William Harrison commanded the Special Operations Training Command, and his presence at a routine physical assessment was unusual enough to make everyone in the area straighten their posture and pay attention. At 52, Harrison moved with the controlled aggression of someone who'd spent decades in special operations before transitioning to a training command role. His uniform was crisp despite the heat, and his expression suggested that he'd seen something that required his personal attention. "Major Chen," Harrison said as he approached the group, "I've been monitoring the afternoon's exercise from the command center. Interesting results." Chen felt her stomach tighten slightly. Harrison wasn't known for making casual visits to training exercises, and his presence suggested that Margaret's performance had attracted attention beyond the immediate training cadre. "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Delacroix has turned in some exceptional numbers today." Harrison's eyes found Margaret, who had moved to attention when she recognized the approaching senior officer. "Staff Sergeant, I understand congratulations are in order. Breaking facility records on your first day is quite an accomplishment." "Thank you, sir," Margaret replied with the kind of neutral professionalism that revealed nothing about her thoughts or feelings regarding the attention her performance was attracting. Harrison studied her for a moment with the kind of careful assessment that senior officers brought to evaluating personnel who didn't fit expected patterns. "Walk with me, Staff Sergeant. I'd like to discuss your background and your objectives for this course." It wasn't really a request, and Margaret fell into step beside Harrison as he began walking toward the administrative complex. Chun watched them go, noting the way other personnel stepped aside to let them pass and the kind of respectful attention that Harrison's presence commanded throughout the facility. The remaining candidates dispersed with the subdued conversations that followed any event that forced people to reconsider their assumptions about competition and capability. Chun overheard fragments of speculation theories about Margaret's background, questions about her training, wondering about what other surprises the next few weeks might hold. Rodriguez approached Chen with his tablet still displaying Margaret's times and performance metrics. "Major, I've been running fitness assessments for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened. That wasn't just good technique or superior conditioning. That was something else entirely." Chun nodded, her eyes still following the distant figures of Harrison and Margaret as they walked toward the command building. "Yes, it was. The question is what exactly it was, and what it means for the rest of the course." The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the California hills, painting the training complex in shades of gold and amber that made everything look softer despite the harsh realities of military training. Chun could see other training groups conducting their own exercises across the facility. Infantry squads practicing urban warfare techniques, armor crews conducting maintenance on their vehicles, pilots reviewing flight plans for night training missions. It was a routine day at one of the military's premier training facilities, except for the presence of a 57-year-old grandmother who was quietly rewriting the record books and forcing everyone around her to question their assumptions about age, capability, and the nature of elite military performance. Chun walked back toward the administrative building, her mind processing the implications of what she'd witnessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for Margaret to demonstrate whatever capabilities she possessed. But Chun was beginning to suspect that the next few weeks would be more about discovering who Margaret Delacroix really was than about whether she could successfully complete sniper training. Behind her, the obstacle course stretched away in the afternoon heat, its obstacles now bearing the invisible record of performance that wouldn't be matched by another candidate for months or possibly years to come. The equipment had been tested, the standards had been met, and the assumptions had been shattered by someone who looked like she should be teaching mathematics rather than redefining the possibilities of military training. The question that remained was what other records might fall before Margaret Delacroix finished proving whatever point she'd come to Fort Meridian to make. Colonel Harrison's office occupied the corner of the administrative building that overlooked the entire training complex. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, he could observe every aspect of the facility's operations, from the rifle ranges where new marksmen learned their craft to the advanced tactical courses where elite operators refined skills that would keep them alive in hostile environments. The walls were decorated with photographs that told the story of a distinguished military career spanning 3 decades, including images from deployments that most people would never hear about in places that didn't appear on public maps. Margaret sat in the chair across from Harrison's desk with the same composed stillness she'd maintained throughout the day. Her silver hair had come loose from its ponytail during the obstacle course, giving her a slightly disheveled appearance that somehow made her look more like someone's grandmother and less like a woman who'd just shattered facility records. Reading glasses hung from their cord, catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Harrison had dismissed his aide and closed the door before settling behind his desk with a manila folder that looked considerably thicker than the standard personnel file. He opened it slowly, revealing pages of documentation that bore classification markings. Margaret couldn't read from her position, though she noticed the distinctive red borders that indicated sensitive material. Margaret Ann Delacroix, Harrison. Read from the file, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who wanted to ensure he had every detail correct. Born June 15, 1968, in Billings, Montana. Father was a rancher, mother was a schoolteacher. Graduated valedictorian from Montana State University with degrees in mathematics and education. Taught high school for 30 years in Missoula. He paused and looked up at Margaret, who listened with the kind of polite attention people paid to biographical summaries they'd heard many times before. That's your official biography, the one that appears in your personnel records and background investigation. Accurate as far as it goes, but not particularly complete. Margaret's expression didn't change, but Harrison noticed a subtle shift. In her posture, not tension exactly, but the kind of alertness that suggested she was paying attention to more than just his words. "Would you like to hear the rest of it?" Harrison asked, his tone conversational despite the serious nature of whatever information the file contained. "I suppose that depends on what the rest of it says," Margaret replied calmly. Harrison turned to the next page in the file, revealing a photograph that was clearly taken from a considerable distance with specialized surveillance equipment. The image showed a much younger Margaret in military fatigues, carrying equipment that looked far more advanced than standard infantry gear, standing beside what appeared to be a helicopter in terrain that didn't look like any training facility. Margaret Delacroix, Staff Sergeant, United States Army Special Operations Command, Harrison continued reading. Military occupational specialty, Special Operations Sniper. Security clearance, top secret with special compartmentalized information. Access. Operational deployments classified under Executive Order authority. He looked up from the file to find Margaret watching him with an expression that had shifted from polite attention to something more calculating. Not hostile, but definitely more engaged than she'd been moments earlier. 17 confirmed eliminations at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, Harrison continued. Record shot, 1 mile 700 yards, under battlefield conditions and terrain classified beyond your current clearance level. Commendations include the Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, and several decorations that don't appear in unclassified records. Margaret sat quietly for several long moments, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of stillness that suggested she was considering how much of what Harrison was reading might be accurate and how much might be speculation or incomplete information. "That's an interesting file," she said finally. "I'm curious where it came from." Harrison smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of humor he'd shown since beginning the conversation. "Let's just say that when someone with your particular background shows up at a special operations training facility and immediately starts breaking records, it tends to attract attention from people who have access to better databases than what Major Chun was working with." He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret with the kind of professional assessment that senior officers brought to evaluating personnel whose capabilities exceeded their apparent credentials. "The question is why you're here. Your age alone should have prevented you from being accepted into this course, even with your background. Someone with significant influence wanted you in this program." Margaret's pause was longer this time, and Harrison could see her weighing different responses before choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people need to prove points that can't be proven in normal circumstances. What kind of points? That assumptions about age and capability can be dangerous. That the military sometimes discards assets based on arbitrary criteria, rather than actual performance. That there are people with skills and experience who could contribute significantly if given the opportunity. Harrison nodded slowly, recognizing the careful phrasing of someone who was revealing information. Without compromising operational security or violating agreements they couldn't discuss. "And you volunteered to be the demonstration case." Something like that. Harrison opened his desk drawer and retrieved a second file, this one bearing even more restrictive classification markings than the first. Margaret noticed the additional security indicators and realized that whatever conversation they were having had just moved into territory that very few people were authorized to discuss. Project Silverline, Harrison said, opening the new file to reveal documents that Margaret couldn't read from her position, but that clearly contained information he considered significant. Experimental program designed to evaluate the potential for extending the operational careers of special operations personnel beyond traditional retirement ages, based on the premise that certain skills and experience are too valuable to lose simply because someone reaches an arbitrary age limit. Margaret's expression sharpened with genuine interest for the first time since the conversation began. Experimental how? Medical monitoring, performance assessments, psychological evaluations, operational effectiveness studies, all conducted under controlled conditions with volunteer subjects who met specific experience and capability criteria. Harrison looked directly at Margaret. Subjects like you. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Margaret was beginning to understand that her presence at Fort Meridian was part of something much larger than a simple training evaluation, and that her performance over the past day had been observed and recorded by people whose interest went far beyond routine course administration. How many subjects, she asked, classified? But you're not the only one, and your performance today has implications that extend well beyond this facility. Harrison closed the second file and returned it to his desk drawer, but kept the first file open in front of him. Major Chen is an excellent instructor who runs one of the best sniper programs in the military. But she doesn't have the security clearances necessary to understand what she's really evaluating when she looks at your performance. As far as she's concerned, you're a remarkable anomaly who's challenging every assumption about age and capability. And as far as you're concerned, you're a test case for whether the military can afford to continue discarding experienced operators simply because they've reached arbitrary age limits. Your shooting and physical performance today weren't just impressive, they were data points in a study that could change how we think about personnel management across the entire special operations community. Margaret absorbed this information with the kind of careful consideration that experienced operators brought to mission briefings that contained more implications than obvious objectives. What happens if the data supports extending operational careers? That depends on how much support the concept generates at levels well above my pay grade. But if someone with your background can outperform candidates who are 25 years younger, it raises questions about whether we're retiring people based on outdated assumptions rather than actual capability assessments. Harrison picked up a pen and made a notation in the margin of Margaret's file, though she couldn't see what he was writing. Tomorrow you'll begin the advanced phases of the course. Camouflage and concealment, stalking techniques, target identification under stress. The kind of skills that separate competent marksmen from true snipers. And you'll be monitoring my performance for purposes beyond course evaluation. Everyone's performance gets monitored. The difference is that your results will be forwarded to people who are making decisions about the future of special operations personnel policies. Harrison's expression became more serious. No pressure, but you're potentially representing a lot of experienced operators who might benefit from having someone prove that age doesn't automatically equal obsolescence. Margaret stood and moved to the window that overlooked the training complex. Below them, she could see other groups conducting their own exercise, younger soldiers, learning skills that she'd been applying operationally when many of them were still in elementary school. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the California hills, painting everything in shades of gold that made the harsh training environment look almost peaceful. There's something else you should know, Harrison said from behind her. Major Chen is going to start asking more pointed questions about your background. She's too good an instructor not to realize that your performance indicates training and experience well beyond what your official records suggest. Margaret turned back toward Harrison's desk. What do you want me to tell her? As much of the truth as your security clearances allow. Chen has secret clearance and a need to know, so you can discuss your general military background without compromising operational details. But the experimental program and the larger policy implications need to remain compartmentalized. Harrison stood and walked around his desk to join Margaret at the window. You've exceeded every performance standard we've thrown at you so far, but the real challenges start tomorrow. Advanced sniper training isn't just about shooting and physical conditioning. It's about mental toughness, psychological resilience, and the ability to function effectively under stress that would break most people. You think my age might become a liability when the pressure increases? I think your age might be the reason you handle pressure better than candidates half your age. Experience has a way of putting temporary difficulties into perspective that youth can't always manage. They stood quietly for several minutes, watching the training complex transition from the busy activity of daytime operations to the quieter routine of evening maintenance and preparation for the next day's challenges. Margaret could see instructors securing equipment, maintenance crews servicing vehicles, and administrative personnel completing the paperwork that kept military training facilities functioning. Colonel, Margaret said finally, I want you to know that I understand what's at stake here. Not just for me, but for everyone who might benefit if this experiment proves that experience has value beyond arbitrary age limits. Harrison nodded. I figured you did. That's why you were selected for this evaluation. Margaret turned away from the window and faced Harrison directly. Then you should also know that I didn't come here to prove I could keep up with younger candidates. I came here to demonstrate that experience and skill can exceed youth and enthusiasm when properly applied. The quiet confidence in her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made promises under circumstances where failure meant more than personal disappointment. Harrison recognized the tone. He'd heard it from special operations personnel who understood that their individual performance represented something larger than their own careers or reputations. In that case, Harrison said, I suggest you get some rest. Tomorrow's exercises are designed to test limits that most people don't even know they have. Margaret moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Colonel, when this evaluation is complete and the data has been forwarded to wherever it's going, what happens to the candidates who don't know they're part of an experiment? Harrison considered the question carefully. They complete their training and continue their careers, hopefully with a better understanding that capability comes in forms they might not expect. Major Chen will continue running an excellent program, and the younger candidates will hopefully learn something about respect and assumptions. And if the experiment fails, if I can't maintain performance levels under increasing pressure, then we'll have learned something valuable about the limits of experience versus youth, and the policy discussions will continue based on different data. Harrison's expression softened slightly. But based on what I've seen today, I don't think that's going to be a problem. Margaret nodded and left the office, closing the door quietly behind her. Harrison returned to his desk and opened both files, reviewing the documentation that painted a picture of someone whose capabilities defied conventional understanding of age-related performance decline. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made California's training facilities ideal for military exercises, requiring precision and attention to detail. The advanced training area was located several miles from the main complex, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through hills covered with brush and rock formations that provided natural concealment opportunities for sniper training. Major Chen arrived at the training site before dawn, using the quiet pre-daylight hours to verify equipment placement and review the day's exercise plans. The advanced phase of sniper training required a different approach than basic marksmanship and physical conditioning. These exercises would test psychological resilience, decision-making under pressure, and the kind of mental toughness that separated snipers from regular marksmen. The 23 candidates assembled in the pre-dawn darkness wearing full camouflage gear that would be essential for the day's stalking exercises. Each one carried a rifle, field equipment, and camouflage materials that would be used to construct concealment positions capable of hiding them from observer teams equipped with advanced optical equipment. Margaret stood among the group wearing the same gear as everyone else, but Chen noticed that her equipment showed signs of modification and personal adjustment that suggested familiarity with extended field operations. Her camouflage pattern had been altered with natural materials that wouldn't have been available through normal supply channels, and her field gear was arranged with the kind of efficiency that came from years of operational experience. Today's exercise is called unknown distance stalking, Chen announced to the assembled candidates. You'll be given a target location approximately 1 mile from this position. Your objective is to move to within 400 meters of the target, establish a concealed firing position, and engage designated targets with precision fire. She gestured toward the hills that stretched away into the morning darkness. Observer. Teams with thermal imaging and advanced optics are positioned throughout the training area. If they detect your movement or identify your position, you fail the exercise. The passing standard requires successful target engagement from a concealed position that remains undetected throughout the exercise. Chen paused to let the implications sink in. This wasn't just about shooting, it was about becoming invisible, while moving through terrain that offered limited concealment, then maintaining that invisibility while conducting precision fire missions that required the kind of calm focus that was impossible to maintain when detection meant failure. Time limit is 8 hours, Chen continued. First shot must be fired before 1400 hours, or the exercise is considered a failure regardless of other performance factors. Questions? No one had questions. These were experienced operators who understood the challenge they were facing, even if none of them had attempted anything quite this demanding under evaluation conditions. Begin, Chen announced. The candidates dispersed into the pre-dawn darkness with the kind of careful movement that suggested they all understood the importance of avoiding detection from the very beginning of the exercise. Chen watched them disappear into the terrain. Through night vision equipment, noting their initial movement patterns and the routes they chose for approaching the target area. Margaret was the last to leave the assembly point, taking several minutes to study the terrain and weather conditions before committing to a specific approach route. When she finally began moving, she chose a path that diverged significantly from the routes taken by other candidates, angling away from the target area rather than toward it, seemingly taking a much longer and more difficult approach to the objective. Chen tracked Margaret's movement through night vision optics, watching her progress with growing interest. Where other candidates were moving directly toward the target area using speed and available concealment to avoid detection, Margaret seemed to be conducting some kind of elaborate reconnaissance of the entire training area before committing to any specific tactical approach. 3 hours into the exercise, Chen received radio reports from observer teams positioned throughout the training area. 7 candidates had been detected and eliminated from the exercise, compromised by movement that was either too fast or too careless for the level of observation they were facing. The remaining candidates were making steady progress toward the target area, with several approaching positions where they could begin establishing firing positions. Margaret's position reports showed that she was still nearly a mile from the target area, having spent the morning conducting what appeared to be an unnecessarily thorough survey of terrain that wouldn't factor into her eventual approach route. Chen was beginning to wonder if Margaret had misunderstood the exercise requirements or was allowing caution to override the aggressive movement necessary to complete the mission within the time limit. At noon, with 2 hours remaining before the firing deadline, Chen received reports that 5 more candidates had been detected and eliminated. The observers were using increasingly sophisticated detection methods as the day progressed, simulating the kind of hostile surveillance that snipers faced in operational environments where enemy forces were actively searching for concealed positions. Margaret's position reports showed that she'd finally begun moving toward the target area, but using an approach route that seemed to involve significantly more terrain obstacles than necessary. Chen watched her progress through binoculars as Margaret moved through areas of dense brush and rocky terrain that would slow her movement considerably while offering only marginal improvements in concealment. With 1 hour remaining before the firing deadline, Chen began to worry that Margaret was going to fail the exercise not because of detection, but because of an overly cautious approach that prevented her from reaching a firing position in time. Several other candidates had already established positions and were preparing to engage their targets, while Margaret was still moving through terrain that would require at least 30 minutes to traverse. At 13:45, 15 minutes before the deadline, Chen received a radio call from Observer Team 3 that changed her understanding of everything that had happened during the exercise. "Control, this is Observer 3. We have eyes on target area Charlie, and we're seeing something unusual." Chen keyed her radio immediately. "Observer 3, report your status." "Ma'am, we've been monitoring this area for 6 hours with thermal imaging, movement detectors, and direct observation. We've identified and tracked 11 candidates who approached this sector, and we've eliminated 9 of them for detection. But we're getting readings that suggest someone has established a firing position within 400 meters of the target, and we can't locate them." Chen felt her pulse quicken. "Clarify your last transmission, Observer 3. "Ma'am, our equipment is showing heat signatures and minimal ground disturbance that indicates recent human activity in the target engagement zone, but we cannot visually identify any concealed positions. Either our equipment is malfunctioning, or someone has achieved a level of concealment that exceeds our detection capabilities." Chen grabbed her binoculars and focused on the target area, scanning for any sign of the position that Observer 3 was describing. The terrain around the target looked completely natural, no obvious disturbances, no equipment visible, no indication that anyone had been in the area recently. At 13:59, 1 minute before the firing deadline, the sound of a precision rifle shot echoed across the training area. Chen immediately focused her binoculars on the designated target, a man-sized silhouette positioned 600 meters from the nearest possible firing position. The target had been hit dead center. "Observer 3, did you identify the firing position?" Chen radioed immediately. "Negative, Control. We heard the shot, but we still cannot locate the shooter's position. Equipment shows continued thermal activity in the engagement zone, but no visual confirmation of personnel or equipment." Chen stared through her binoculars at terrain that looked completely undisturbed, trying to understand how someone could fire a precision shot and remain completely invisible to observer teams equipped with the most advanced detection equipment available to the military. "All stations, this is Control," Chen announced over the radio net. "Exercise complete. All candidates return to the assembly area for debrief." Over the next 30 minutes, the remaining candidates emerged from concealment throughout the training area and began making their way back to the assembly point. Chen watched each one appear, mentally accounting for personnel and trying to identify who might have taken the shot that Observer 3 couldn't locate. Margaret was the last to appear, emerging from terrain nearly half a mile from where the shot had originated. She moved with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout all previous exercises, carrying her equipment with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested the day's activities had been routine rather than exceptionally challenging. "Staff. Sergeant Delacroix," Chen called out as Margaret approached the assembly area. "Report your exercise status." Margaret stopped and rendered a precise salute. Mission complete. Major. Target engaged at 13:59 hours from a concealed position that remained undetected throughout the exercise. Chen studied Margaret's face for any sign of satisfaction or pride in what she'd accomplished. What she found was the same matter-of-fact professionalism that had characterized all of Margaret's interactions since arriving at the training facility. How? Chen asked simply. Margaret considered the question with the thoughtful expression of someone who was trying to provide useful information rather than impress anyone with her capabilities. Concealment isn't just about hiding from observation. It's about becoming part of the environment in ways that make detection impossible, even when someone knows you're there. It was another perfectly reasonable explanation that somehow failed to account for what had actually happened. Chen realized that Margaret had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in her previous experience with sniper training, and that trying to understand those capabilities through normal questioning wasn't going to be productive. The debrief session that followed was unlike any Chen had conducted in her 6 years of running the sniper course. Of the 23 candidates who'd begun the exercise, 11 had been detected and eliminated by observer teams. 7 had successfully reached firing positions, but had been compromised before they could engage their targets. 4 had managed to fire shots that missed their designated targets. Only Margaret had completed the exercise successfully reaching an undetected firing position, engaging the target with precision fire, and maintaining concealment throughout the entire operation. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen announced to the assembled candidates, today's exercise had a success rate of approximately 4%. That's significantly lower than our normal standards, but it reflects the advanced nature of the challenges you're facing in this program. She looked directly at Margaret, who was sitting quietly among the other candidates with the same composed attention she'd shown throughout the training cycle. Staff Sergeant Delacroix achieved a perfect score on today's exercise, demonstrating concealment and marksmanship capabilities that represent the absolute standard for military sniper operations. The silence that followed was different from the quiet that had characterized previous reactions to Margaret's performance. This wasn't surprise or confusion. It was the kind of respectful recognition that professional soldiers gave to capabilities. They understood and respected even when they couldn't replicate them. That evening, Chen submitted her daily training report with performance evaluations that would be forwarded through channels she didn't fully understand to people whose interest in the program extended beyond routine training administration. Margaret Delacroix's scores were so far beyond normal parameters that Chen included a personal note recommending immediate review by senior command authority. What Chen didn't know was that her reports were being analyzed by teams of specialists who were tracking performance indicators across multiple experimental programs designed to evaluate whether the military was discarding valuable assets based on arbitrary criteria rather than actual capability assessments. Margaret's performance at Fort Meridian was providing data that would influence personnel policies, affecting thousands of experienced operators whose careers were being terminated based on age rather than ability. Her shooting scores, physical conditioning results, and tactical performance were being compared against baseline standards that had been established by much younger candidates over the course of several years. In every measurable category, Margaret was exceeding those standards by margins that suggested the military's assumptions about age-related performance decline might be fundamentally flawed. The implications would ripple through special operations commands throughout the military, influencing decisions about retirement policies, personnel retention, and the value of experience versus youth in military effectiveness calculations. But those policy discussions would happen in offices far from Fort Meridian, conducted by people whose names Margaret would never know. For now, she was simply a 57-year-old grandmother who'd come to sniper school to prove a point about capability and respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that. Assumptions about age and performance could be dangerous when they prevented organizations from recognizing the value of experience and skill. The training would continue, the records would continue to fall, and the quiet revolution in military thinking would continue to build momentum through the accumulated evidence of one person's refusal to accept limitations that existed more in other people's minds than in actual performance capabilities. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.